Nashville. I am Jonas Parello-Plesner. I have the pleasure of moderating this next session on free speech challenges in democracies. I think we're all mesmerized, captivated, and energized by listening to Masih Alinejad. I was, at least. We will try to, our small degree, all of us, to keep up that momentum, that sort of fight for free speech. Yes, okay. That's a challenge. I'll give it to one of the others, that one of you is welcome to sing as part of this as well. You've seen it done on stage, so I might not be the one, but thanks for the Chancellor's encouragement. So we're going to speak about free speech in different countries. I have here next to me a really great panel. I have Rana Ayyub from the Washington Post, Indian journalist and author of the Gujarat Files. I've actually been reading it here, so I recommend it to everybody. It did dispel a lot of my illusions about India as the world's greatest democracy, but you can speak to us much more sort of succinctly about that. I have next Mchangama. I think in this room he maybe needs not too much introduction, but still the executive director of the Future of Free Speech Initiative, and in many ways our host today. And you have also written a mammoth of a book that I really encourage, that it's just called Free Speech. Although, as Samar Rushdie said yesterday, the wonder of bookstores is there even more books. So I was about to say that you have said the definitive word about free speech, but there's still freedom of choice to read other books as well. But it's a great book. I have Szabolcs Panyi, investigative editor from Central European Investigations, VSquare, out of Hungary, Budapest-based investigative journalist, focused on uncovering corruption, Russian and Chinese influence, and cyber surveillance in Central Europe. You're also a member of the Pegasus project, uncovering spyware abuses back in 2021. The Hungarian government has been hacking your phone and been surveilling you. I don't know if they're listening today. I hope they are, because we're going to talk about free speech. We have, last but not least, and Guilherme, Döring, Cunha, Pereira from Gazeta do Povo from Brazil, and Chief Executive Officer of Grupo Paranaense de Comunicação. Was that okay? GRP.com, it's abbreviated. The largest communication group of the state of Paraná, and one of the foremost media companies in Brazil. And you're going to speak us about, of course, also free speech in Brazil. So I'll let each of you speak for 5, really max 7 minutes, and I'll use my moderator. The reason for that is that we don't just go with like 3 minutes very shortly, is because it's so different situations in the country. So you need to give us a little bit of background. Me, for example, reading Rana's book, there's a lot I didn't know about. I even actually had to look up precisely where the state of Gujarat is, where I've never been. So I think we need that sort of context. But I also will use my time as moderator to try to tease together, also as we had yesterday, some of the discussions, what is actually free speech? What are the boundaries we want on, like, what can government do? How do we curb disinformation? Should governments even be involved in that? Should tech companies? So I think some of these things will also be really interesting for also the debate for all of us. But now I really want us to turn first to Rana to explain about the situation in India, what you see as sort of the biggest challenge for free speech. All of you are allowed also to give grades if you want. This is free speech up here, so if you want to be provocative and give a grade to your country, you're welcome as well. Rana, the word is yours.
Thank you, Jonas. Good morning, everyone. You know, the challenge about speaking about India, especially, this is the second day of this summit, is that how does one speak about the world's largest democracy in the context of free speech? Because the illusion and the myth around the world is that we are the world's largest democracy, and free speech is inherent to our nature. Nobody views India and talks about India in the same breath that we have spoken about other countries since yesterday. Nobody sees India in the same breath. The truth is that we Dem and other democratic indices have labeled India as a country on the verge of an autocracy, that we are the world's largest democracy with 1.4 billion people, where free press is now an illusion. That journalists like us, journalists like Ritu, who's in the audience, who runs a publication called The Quint, are subjected to tax raids, money laundering. It's a new thing that dictators are using around the world. We are facing multiple cases against us. I got a message from my lawyer this morning for a summon that I've got to a court. You need to get court permissions to travel when you are speaking about democracies. This is India is rated as on the 159th position in the World Press Freedom Index out of 180. And as Salman Rushdie said yesterday, when he was speaking about transnational killings, you don't expect the world's largest democracy to go around killing critics and dissenters willy-nilly in other countries. That's something we expect from countries like, well, you know best. So it's very difficult to talk about India and free speech because over the last 10 years since Narendra Modi, who is the Indian Prime Minister who has come to power, some of India's best-known journalists and editors are now independent journalists. We no longer get employed in mainstream publications. We are no longer getting bylines in mainstream publications. Kashmir, which is an embattled military zone in India, journalists in Kashmir don't even have the privilege of coming to platforms like this and speak. We do not. Most of them are jailed. Some of India's finest journalists are behind bars. Our civil society is almost as good as dead. We have a few vibrant civil society voices and human rights voices who are facing money laundering, tax evasion. Arundhati Roy, the famous journalist and writer Arundhati Roy, faced sedition charges earlier this year. So that says something about the world's largest democracy. And of course, we have Prime Minister Modi coming to America. He's a state guest for the United States because the United States normally sees India as a bulwark against China, not realizing that when you're fighting this country and platforming it as a bulwark against China, it is a country which is almost on the verge of becoming China itself. I'm a proud Indian. I'm a proud Indian, and I hate to keep repeating that, but in my country, where I'm a Muslim minority also, it's held against me that I'm not patriotic enough. When somebody like me, a woman of color and a Muslim journalist, criticizes India on a foreign soil, it is not seen as a criticism of my government. It is seen as a criticism of my country. Modi has conflated himself with India, which is why some of the best journalists in India, some of the best voices in India are facing sedition charges. So that is the state of free press in India. I'm sorry to break your illusion. I'm assuming that you came here believing in the idea of democracy, but democracy in India right now only exists on paper. This year, Mr. Modi received a minor setback when he did not get a complete majority. And to prove that he is not deterred by it, he made sure that he inflicted sedition charges on other writers. At this point of time, we have discriminatory laws against India's Muslim minorities, who are the third largest population in the world. We have the Citizenship Act, which discriminates against Muslim citizens in India. That's what democracy looks like. And like I said, it's extremely critical to talk about a country like India in the realm of free speech, because we talk about Iran, we talk about other countries, we talk about dictatorships, but we don't speak about India in the same narrative. And it's important to tell the world the story of what's happening in India to the Indian democracy and the voices that are being suppressed.
Thank you, Rana. I might, though, just ask a follow-up question, because you were able to do this in India and get this published, and it was really fascinating undercover investigative journalism you did, posing as a filmmaker from the US, coming back to India. And so amazing feat of journalism. So it kind of makes me a little bit optimistic as well, saying you were able to do this.
I must tell you, though, that it's a self-published book because nobody was willing to publish that book. So I took a loan and I self-published that book, and it is now a bestseller in 14 languages. We have sold 730,000 copies in 14 languages. But the fact is that mainstream publications in India pretended that this book did not exist. I wrote an open letter asking the Supreme Court of India to take cognizance of this book and the findings of this book. When I went, basically, I went undercover. I wore multiple cameras on my body, pretending to be a Hindu nationalist girl from an institute, a film institute in LA, and I went to Gujarat, met ministers in the Modi government who were then accused of inciting a genocide of 1,000 Muslims in the year 2002. And none of those officials would speak before commissions of inquiry for fear of being hounded. So I had to go undercover as this woman who hated Muslims, who hated Islam, and then I infiltrated the rank and file of the Modi government with cameras on my body for 8 months through circumstances that I do not wish to recount because it made me get psychiatric treatment later. And anybody, when I go to journalism institutes right now, a lot of journalism students tell me, tell us how do we go undercover? And I tell them, do not do that. It ruins your life like nothing else. It has ruined my life psychologically, but again, it's a small price to pay to expose what a regime can do to silence minorities and dissenting voices. So this book was self-published, and till today, people pretend it does not exist.
Thank you, Rana. Good on you. That's why I wanted to bring it out, because I've read it and I've sort of followed through your writing, what you've gone through with that. I'll turn now to Jacob next on it. You will go, I think, more and make an analysis of, you're of course Dane by origin, but of particularly in Europe more broadly, the state of play on free speech, and particularly also how government regulation actually can be a sort of hindrance to free speech.
Yes. So one of the tragedies of India, if you may allow, is Gandhi said that freedom of expression and association were the two lungs that were absolutely necessary for liberty. And he was prosecuted for sedition under a British Colonial Sedition Act. And we see the same thing in Hong Kong. So that's just a historic curiosity which sort of shows the backsliding, if you like. But one of the issues that I see in European democracies, the situation is far better than in India. It's in most European countries, the situation is far better than in Hungary. It's better than in Brazil. But we are seeing, I think there used to be a time where you had sort of quite bright lines between speech restrictions in open democracies and authoritarian states. I think it's becoming more blurred. And I think we're seeing a movement where we don't have sedition laws as such, but laws against hate speech, terrorism, and so on, and now most worryingly, disinformation, come to serve as sedition law. So let me give you an example. What are the optics of an Israeli Jewish woman being arrested by the police for peaceful protest in Berlin? Like, you don't need a lot of historical awareness to say that's not a good optics, but that's the reality today. So an Israeli woman who lived in Germany for 20 years, who was a pro-Palestinian, walked into a square in Berlin with a sign that said, as an Israeli Jew, stop the genocide in Gaza, and was arrested by police. She's been arrested on three occasions, had her sign confiscated on the basis of hate speech, because Germany's reaction to the aftermath of October 7th has been to basically ban pro-Palestinian protests and basically say that if you chant from the river to the sea, that is hate speech, that you can be convicted. And what we also see in a country in Germany is that there's an increasing fear about the consequences of social media. So it's not uncommon now in Germany, and again, the historical parallels are a bit troubling. It's not uncommon now in Germany for the police to show up in your apartment at early morning, raid your house, arrest you, confiscate your tablet and your laptop if you've written something on social media that contravenes the rather expansive list of prohibitions on speech in German law. So this can be hate speech. It can even be insulting politicians. So a famous example was someone who wrote of a politician who had broken COVID rules that he was a dick and police show up in your apartment. That's not something that you would associate with an open democracy. Only a few weeks ago, an American living in Germany was convicted for using anti-constitutional symbols because he published a book critical of COVID policies which had a swastika on a face mask. Now, quite clearly, this was not something who was advocating Nazism. It was someone who made a hyperbolic comparison between COVID policies and Nazism, but that's a pretty common trick to use the so-called Nazi card, but that's a criminal prosecution. France, France is where the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was born. But we also see in France a closing of permissible speech. So under President Macron, 34 organizations, civil society organizations, have been banned by decree. So that's more than under any other president in the lifetime of the Fifth Republic. And what happens when an association is banned by decree is that it's signed by the president, the prime minister, and the minister of interior. Out of these 34 cases, only one has been overturned by the courts. And so who are these organizations? So one of them was like a Muslim organization who accused the French government of being anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. And the government said, well, these are sort of incite hatred against the state. And also, on the Facebook account of this organization, there were anti-Semitic stuff written by third-party users, so not the organization itself. And the government said, well, you didn't remove them, you didn't moderate them, and therefore we can close you down. But this has not only happened to Muslim organizations, it also happened to sort of conservative right-wing organizations, to anti-fascist organizations, and so on. So that's, again, something which is quite worrying, because it gives a lot of power to governments to narrow the permissible limits of dissent. Again, it's important to note that Germany and France you can still be very critical of the government. You have peaceful transfer of power. You have great media organizations that do critical investigations of what's going on. But the trend is very much towards that voices that are seen as too extreme can now be punished. And I'll maybe end with what I think is a very symbolic shift. So that's my own country, our country, Jonas, Denmark. So Denmark, as some of you might know, is one of the most secular liberal countries in the world. We had a blasphemy law that was abolished in 2017, but no one had been convicted for blasphemy until since 1946. But then there were these far-right protesters who burned Qurans around the country. And I'm not a fan of book burnings, but it's still, in my opinion, a symbolic protest against ideas that you don't like. But what happened was that a number of countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, of course, put pressure on the Danish government to say, you have to do something about this. And Denmark suddenly did a shift. Jonas's boss, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, our former prime minister, you might remember at a time where a Danish newspaper published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, there was huge pressure on Denmark to do something about it. The Danish government said, no, we're not going to cave in. But now the Danish government caved in and passed this law saying you cannot desecrate religious text in public, or which is punishable by 2 years. So that's a shift where you see that authoritarian states now have the power to impose their norms on open democracies like Denmark caving in for something that no one has been punished for a very long time. So that is the trajectory. We can get more into sort of some of the stuff that's coming out of the European Union, but I know that will be touched upon in some of the panels on social media, AI, Digital Services Act, and so on. But that's the trajectory that I see in many European governments, that there's a fear really of free speech, that it's seen as a threat more than a defense of basic democracy. And I think that's quite a dangerous development, because we don't have to scratch the first surface of history to see that there's not it's not a natural law that Western democracy will have free speech and democracy.
Thanks, Jacob. Really good example, and I thought very concrete on sort of the boundaries of free speech. Personally, I agree completely with the assessment of the sort of caving in of the Danish government on the new law. I'm a little bit more in doubt on the examples on chanting from the river to the sea, which I can, and maybe I show my biases here, also see as a sort of call for the annihilation of the state of Israel. So I think it really...
Just to be like, so one of the examples is a woman saying, from the river to the sea, we demand equality. So, you know, if you interpret that as sort of incitement to violence and genocide, that's a very, very, very broad interpretation. And this was a person who was arrested, you know, manhandled by police officers, a woman. So it's a very, very broad definition. And I would argue that even from the river to the sea, you know, should not meet the requirement of incitement to violence or genocide.
No, and you know, I love your unwavering commitment to freedom of speech and passing the Voltaire test always, of even if it's something we disagree a lot with, then we should be able to hear it. Let's now turn to Szabolcs and speak about Hungary and your own experiences, and of course how you see the situation for free speech in your country and with your own experiences as a journalist.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being interested. Hungary is a case, so actually I feel like I should sit in a panel between this panel and our next panel. Actually, a couple of years ago, the European Parliament passed a resolution with an overwhelming majority saying that Hungary is not actually a democracy anymore. It's called like a hybrid regime of electoral autocracy, which means that we still do have free elections, but these are not fair elections because the state uses its own resources to campaign on behalf of the ruling party. And what I'm going to talk about mostly is media capture, which is really integral to the rule of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in Hungary. And this is basically a strategy of staying in power that he's trying to export to other countries, not just in Europe, but also his having his tentacles all around the world, although Hungary is just a country of 10 million people. But first, I like to talk about what was, I guess, already mentioned here, is that I've been a victim and target of cyber surveillance by my own government, and I was also a member of the so-called Pegasus project. It was an investigation led by a French non-profit outlet called Forbidden Stories. From the United States, I think it was the Washington Post who participated in this investigation. And basically what happened is that there was a leak of 50,000 phone numbers, which were selected as targets by different clients of NSO Group, an Israeli spyware company, who was selling this tool that can infiltrate your phone, take full control, use it as a covered listening device, even turn on the camera remotely. So this Israeli company, with an approval from the Israeli Ministry of Defense, sold this tool to a handful of countries, democracies, autocracies, and what we got hold of is basically the list of targets from, of course, a very specific time frame in the 2017, 18, 19 years. And what we found out is that although Hungary only had, I don't know, like more than 300 phone numbers participating in this target list, but apart from my phone number, we identified at least 5 or 6 other journalists, mostly investigative journalists, and also media company owners. And what we uncovered is that although Hungary is a member of the European Union and NATO, there are certain international agreements that officially the Hungarian government is following, but below the surface in a very sneaky way. So it's very important that this type of oppression is sneaky. It's not using force. Journalists are not getting jailed. We're not getting beaten up on the street. There are no hitmen sent after us because there's no need for it. What we figured out is that it basically fit the pattern. What we already knew about the regime in Hungary is that they are not in the business of trying to kill journalists. They are in the business of trying to kill the stories by putting a spyware on journalists' phones so that they can identify our sources and possibly they can intimidate our sources and can prevent whistleblowers from contacting journalists and leak us stories about abuses of power or corruption. But what they can also do is that basically they can find dirt on media company owners, those who still own certain media outlets that publish critical outlets about the government. Since 2010, when Viktor Orbán came to power, what he did in a very strategic way is media capture. What we've seen in my country is that the state used its own resources, meaning state-owned banks, which then gave loans to proxies, to seemingly independent businessmen who use these state resources to buy up previously free media and then turn into propaganda. And through these methods, the government essentially took control over more than half of Hungary's media, especially focusing on local, regional newspapers, on broadcasts, TVs and radios, because they know very well that these are the media that their own voters, who tend to be more rural voters from smaller cities, lesser educated, older people, these are the outlets that they consume news from. So what they did basically is that they didn't have to, I don't know, jail the journalists who write critical questions. They bought up the media, so that was a more efficient way and a more civilized way of cracking down on independent journalism. And then, of course, when they saw that there's still independent reporting happening, that's mostly on the online sphere in my country, then, of course, they deployed spywares against investigative journalists such as myself, just to make sure that they get a heads up of what I'm working on, and also to make sure that they can identify our sources and discourage people from sharing crucial information with us. But more than that, and this is something where we've seen a bigger shift from democracy to an autocratic regime, is that the government of Viktor Orbán started to copy-paste Kremlin methods that we see now all over the region, basically trying to stigmatize independent journalists and also NGOs, human rights activists and lawyers as foreign agents, as mostly agents of the United States, agents of the CIA, and agents of probably the most famous Hungarian person besides Viktor Orbán, agents of George Soros. And basically they created a Russia-style law and an institution that is tasked with investigating so-called foreign-funded NGOs and journalists. The whole idea is that we're going to be publicly labeled as foreign agents because, as I said, the government made sure that they can buy up all the large mainstream media outlets. So obviously what independent journalists could do after this is that we're relying more and more on funding coming from the European Union or from the United States. So now they are going after the financial resources of independent journalism. And of course, again, it's not like we're banned from publishing anything that we want. It's not like we're getting prosecuted for what we write, but these are methods that undermine both the basics of how an independent journalist works, that I work with sources. When I meet with someone who wants to leak something to me, obviously I'm not revealing that person's identity, but when there's a spyware on my phone, then obviously that puts him or her in jeopardy. And also they're going after the financial foundations, the economic foundations of independent journalism by trying to cut us off from any kind of funding from outside of Hungary. And this is basically a position where we're at right now. I'm not saying that this trend cannot be stopped, because I still believe that, for example, my outlet in Hungary, it's called Direct 36. It's a small investigative outlet, has I think 3,000 supporters. They give us recurring donations, and we can survive on that, but at the cost of only having like 10 people on staff and reaching a very limited audience, mostly in Budapest and in bigger cities. And I'm not saying that this has to be like this, but the problem is that, as it was said, as in the case of India, there are always other diplomatic, more important issues that basically overrule other countries' perspectives when it comes to Hungary. The European Union should have stopped what's going on in Hungary, which is called democratic backsliding. There are already some methods there to try to punish the government from abusing, for example, EU funds and stealing it. But still, I believe it's too late, and it's up to the international community to point out that although this country, Hungary, disguises itself as a democracy, disguises itself as a country that still upholds free speech and free media, in reality, what's happening is the opposite.
Thank you. A follow-up question on the foreign agents law that you described. This is a situation that's, of course, happening in a number of other countries. We see Georgia right now, the country heading into elections, and what has been really discussed a lot has been the introduction of this foreign agent law. At the same time, you also see in democracies that we increasingly try to protect our open societies, rightly so, I think, from autocracies, but also that often means that we would do a little bit some of the same. You would see here over the last years in the US how Chinese state television has been labeled as foreign agents. And again, I think that's correct, but it does give a sort of really a situation, global situation, where of course Putin would be saying, when he's encouraging a government that he's close to in Europe, oh, but we're just doing the same thing, and this is just about protecting. So it's a big question. I don't really have the answer myself, but I would like your thoughts on that, having been seeing this insidious way of it happening in Hungary, but also the way it's a global play here as well around freedom of expression.
Well, as we say in Hungary, this is the classic Bolshevik method to accuse your opponent of what you are doing. I mean, there's a very clear distinction between these two cases. So when an independent journalist in Hungary or in any other European country receives, for example, a grant from the European Commission, it's completely transparent. We publish it on our website. Everyone knows who finances our operations, and these are support mechanisms where the donors have no say over the content. That's like auto question. And then you have different actors in the United States or in Europe who get financed from Chinese or Russian sources, and they do everything to hide the source of that money and use different layers to disguise the origins. And then there is a very legitimate national security investigation by the FBI here in the US or by other counterintelligence agencies in Hungary. But what I wanted to add is that Viktor Orbán's government is not only trying to crack down on so-called foreign agents and foreign influence in Hungary, at the same time what they are doing is that they are meddling in the media and the politics of other countries. It was just revealed by my colleagues a couple of months ago that Euronews, which is a well-known European TV channel, was actually secretly bought by Hungarian money, by the Hungarian state, using a Portuguese investment firm as a front but in reality it serves Viktor Orban's long-term interest. And also the Hungarian government bought media in Slovenia, in North Macedonia, in other Balkans countries, and currently it's in news in Poland that TVN, which is the largest Polish privately owned TV channel owned by an American company, they're selling the TV, and a Hungarian proxy of Viktor Orban is trying to buy that because he knows very well that in order for him to sustain his power, he needs allies throughout Europe, and to support his allies, he's trying to export his way of staying in power, which is capturing media. And this is completely different. So these are different methods when real journalists receive funding from, I don't know, family foundations in Sweden, from the Open Society institution of George Soros, and we publish, we're transparent about where the financing is coming from, and it's completely different when authoritarian actors are trying to disguise the source of the money using front companies, using strawmen to basically carry out influence operations abroad.
Thank you. Really important clarifications. I did not know about Euronews that had just been bought sort of by Hungary. I actually just published an op-ed there a couple of weeks ago, highly critical of China. That might then maybe not be possible in a month or two with new ownership. Guilherme, let's go now to Brazil. It's a country I personally have a lot of admiration for. In my youth, I traveled to 22 out of 27 states, and so I've seen the people, I've seen the geography, but of course, that does not mean that there are not a lot of challenges to free speech in your country. So let's hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Honored to be here. Very inspired by all some so nice panelists. I apologize for my weak English. That's why I take advantage of the. We read the explanations here. I believe many of you have followed the news about the suspension of X operations in Brazil, and probably in the supposed clash between Elon Musk and the Brazilian Supreme Court judge. Okay. Given the contours of what was published, the unusual nature of the decision, and the peculiarities of personalities involved, I think it's difficult to adequately assess this episode without keeping in mind a broader context. I try to offer this context. Let me try to summarize the nature in this essence of the serious crisis that freedom of expression is currently facing in Brazil. So, a quick characterization. Unlike what our colleagues from India and Hungary have reported, this is not about restriction from an authoritarian and populist government. It is not about restrictions coming from the right, quite the opposite, almost always, but not always. These restrictions are aimed at combating the right. They come from the judiciary. It's not unusual origin from these kinds of restrictions. The Supreme Court enjoy, at least to a certain extent, the agreement and complicity of a significant part of the opinion makers, including traditional media outlets. This reflects a broader trend seen throughout the Western world, a growing distrust in freedom of expression as a truly important value, which, even though not absolute, deserves robust protection. And what was the factual context in which this crisis is unfolding? What was the backdrop? Just very quickly. Polarization, obviously, which has been intensified in recent years and reached a peak during the last presidential election 2 years ago. A real atmosphere of animosity between our previous president, Bolsonaro, and much of the media and the judiciary. I won't analyze here whether that was justified or not, but there was a clear concern in certain circles that Bolsonaro, in a second term, could advance an anti-democratic agenda or even potentially stage a coup. Widespread accusations that Bolsonaro, our previous president, used and abused fake news throughout his term in the election period. In addition, the media echoed a general fear of fake news, considered by then perhaps as the most serious problem facing democracies today. At the same time, for some years now, long before this political clash, universities and media outlets had already been expressing concern about hate speech. And there was, and this is still It's an ongoing debate in society about the regulation of social media and other digital platforms. But precisely, specifically, what were the concrete decisions? What are the concrete decisions made by the higher courts that have affronted or are affronting freedom of expression, to be very precise? To understand the whole situation, it's important to mention the first decision. It was a decision taken 5 years ago. The Supreme Court opened a sui generis criminal investigation, which is still open, targeting fake news against the court. In reality, it also targets critical opinions, criticism about the court. One judge, Alexandre de Moraes, the same one involved in the Musk case, is simultaneously the victim, investigator, accuser, and judge. Under his authority, for all Brazilians, anything posted on social media can be the subject of this inquiry. A general ongoing investigative power over all Brazilians. For example, a group of prominent national businessmen was engaged in a group of messages, specifically they had a group in WhatsApp. In it, they exchanged ideas about what would be better for the country, whether Lula or Bolsonaro, with some even stating they would prefer a coup. They would prefer a coup rather than having Lula again in power. A journalist who managed to join the group published the conversation in a newspaper. Alexandre de Moraes ordered search and seizure operations at their homes, confiscating all phones and computers. A year later, he reversed the decision, admitting there was insufficient cause for such measures. All these businessmen, once active on social media fell silent. Cancellation of Brazil's biggest podcaster, a third case. I'm just taking some of the numerous cases that we have had recently. In a show discussing the limits of democracy alongside two congressmen, he said, "I think a Nazi party could exist." He didn't defend Nazism. He is obviously against it, but argued for the possibility that a Nazi party could exist in a democracy. YouTube and other social networks canceled him and demonetized him. The Brazilian judiciary subsequently deemed the platform's actions non-abusive and additionally revoked his passport. He now lives in the US, and he was not a right-wing activist. Restriction of parliamentary immunity. The most recent case occurred 2 days ago, but lawmakers were convicted for expressing opinions, some of which may have been abusive, but were traditionally protected by parliamentary immunity. During the election campaign 2 years ago, countless decisions violated basic principles of Brazilian law, such as the prohibition of prior censorship, explicitly stated in the Constitution, the prohibition of excessive sanctions due to the risk of a chilling effect, for instance, the banning of social media profiles, even of political parties during the electoral period, confusion between facts and opinion, and disregard for due legal process. Most, though not all, of the victims are right-wing politicians and influencers, a small minority of whom could be considered far-right. We are talking about a significant number, dozens, perhaps hundreds of cancelled profiles. The victims have no access to case files and do not know why they were cancelled or being investigated. Everything is always justified by the argument that protecting democracy requires these exceptions to normal standards. And there is a deafening silence from organizations that traditionally defend freedom of expression, the Brazilian Bar Association, newspapers, the journalist associations, etc. In the post-electoral period, this new repressive standard was normalized and even institutionalized through normative creation. Without constitutional authority, the Electoral Court issued a number of resolutions changing our legal standards. Numerous politicians and influencers were cancelled. This is the context in which access suspension in Brazil occurred. Returning then to this surreal case, briefly, it was a single judge decision, later upheld by the full court, which overturned several legal principles. First of all, Alexandre de Moraes issued a secret order for X. So in the beginning of the situation, Alexandre de Moraes issued a secret order for X to cancel a number of profiles under penalty of a fine, without stating the reason for the cancellations. He hinted that X should cancel them, not as a judicial order, but voluntarily for violating the platform's terms of use, and threatened the rest of X's legal representative in Brazil. X chose to defy the order, refused to violate citizens' and clients' fundamental rights, and closed its Brazilian office to avoid sanctions against Brazilian employees. In my opinion, all sound decisions. What followed, however, was a horror show. I'll point out just one. In this decision, Alexandre de Moraes did the unthinkable. He prohibited all Brazilians from using X through technological means like a VPN, imposing a restriction on 210 million people, none of whom were parties to the case or even notified, under penalty of a fine. A legal regression of centuries. Brazilian Constitution and also sound criminal procedure principles being completely overturned. The Brazilian Constitution also states that no one shall be obliged to do or refrain from doing something except by virtue of law, which is obviously not the case. As a counterpoint, the absurdity was such that finally, the Brazilian Bar Association reacted with an wiki note informing that it would appeal against this part of the ruling. Just final assessment. In conclusion, what I would say, it's a very weird, very unusual situation. So I'm dropped to the phrase elite panic, coined by sociologists Lee Clark and Carol Chess and mentioned in the book Free Speech by our host here. And this perfectly describes what is going on there. Sorry. What is happening in Brazil? It's a global phenomenon that in our country, due to its peculiar political moment, has accelerated an unprecedented demolition of freedom of expression as a key component of a democratic society. By elite panic, I mean a level of fear regarding fake news and hate speech so intense that it leads those afflicted by it to forget the importance of freedom of expression in a democratic society and lose the ability to adequately balance the competing values at stake. I believe this can be reversed. It's probably an easier situation than that mentioned here in India and Hungary, but it will require society to wake up to the issue, to be aware of the values at stake. Gazeta do Povo, the outlet I lead, has played an important role in raising this awareness. Discomfort is growing, but I also think that international pressure, more prestigious figures denouncing the state of affairs, can accelerate the reaction. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Guilherme. Really interesting. It's also the time of this debate where you can join it. This is a free speech summit, so we want you to exercise that right. Come up and ask a question. There are mics here and over here, and you're allowed to say anything, no restrictions. Or maybe one, you're not allowed to yell fire if there's no fire in here. But apart from that, the word is yours. I mean, we've heard from a really broad range of countries, broad range situations, but of course all with that focus on free speech and the conditions and restrictions. So I'll start over here, and we go over here.
Good morning. Thank you all for what a terrific panel. So one of the classic challenges that authoritarian regimes often face is sometimes called the information problem, because there are no free and fair elections, because the press is circumscribed and the courts are not independent. The rulers are often blind or deaf to what's going on in their own countries. They don't know where the problems are, what policies are popular, or which of their agents are reliable and are carrying out their orders. So I guess my question for you is, how do you see authoritarian regimes or any particular country that you know of trying to solve this problem, or at least mitigate the harms that come when you restrict free speech, yet still try to maintain control and run an efficient government?
Thanks. I will also say that the next panel is going to be on free speech in autocratic countries as well, so we'll also dig into it there. Over here, I think we'll take the questions now and then bring it all up to the panel in the end. So.
Well, it's not only a question, it's also a comment about, I'm from Israel, and I hear the Middle East and Israel and the Palestinians on October 7th being brought on an hourly basis. And I think that free speech first should be about true free speech, about the truth first, and not about free speech. Since October 7th, you see in campuses all over the world, not just over here, the people supporting the minority over the majority. In this case, they're supporting the Palestinian cause over Israel because they're minority, but ignoring that we have a terrorist organization that murdering, raping, and burning babies in kitchen ovens in front of their mothers. This is what happened on October 7th. So, and I know for many of you doesn't know anything about the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 promised by the British to promote only a Jewish state to the Jewish people in the Holy Land, not an Arab state. So all the claim about occupation and free Palestine from the river to the sea are false claims by universities, by politicians, or by anyone that support lies. So first, free speech should be about the truth and not about minority and majority. And then you can say whatever you want. And another thing is that if you read the Hamas Pledge of Allegiance, if you read the Pledge of Allegiance of the PLO, there is no differences. And the river from the sea was mentioned here, and the PLO and Hamas Pledge of Allegiance say the same thing. We have to annihilate the Jewish people from Palestine, from the river to the sea, and then it's going to consider as a success.
We might have to call you also just because there's so many behind. So I want thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. We'll go over here, and then we go back over here.
Hi, I want to thank the panel for their wonderful...
Closer to mic.
Oh, yes, here we go.
There we go.
Thank you to the panel for your comments today. I wanted to highlight a quote that was said, which is that oppression is sneaky. And I think that throughout the panel we heard different stories of oppression being something that was crept up versus imposed, as was in Brazil. And I was wondering what the panel would comment on as far as how much of oppression is built through the apathy of citizens in that kind of more sneaky way versus how much of it is a result of government strong-arming and opposition. And then in the context of that answer, how much is it the responsibility of the individual citizen to actively fight on a day-to-day level against oppression, and how much are citizens able to do that depending on the techniques used by growing authoritarian governments?
Thank you. So, I mean, I'm no dictator, but I do have a job as moderator, which is also looking down at that clock. We have 2.5 minutes left as well. Let me try to, if you do ask very short questions, to sneak in one from each side, and then we go quickly up to the panel to round it up. Over there.
Sure, yeah, this will be a quick question and on quite a narrow topic about Hungary. Perhaps a loaded question, but obviously Orban has become a darling of the MAGA right and Musk fanboys. And I was just wondering, we've heard about Orban's methods. Does that not just expose MAGA Republicans as completely insincere and unprincipled defenders of free speech?
Thanks. Over here, and then we come back up. Sorry, guys that also lined up, but we can do one more.
Thank you for being here today. I was thinking back on many of the protests that have happened, and I feel like many of them have gained their oomph and power from the fact that governments are pushing back on free speech. So I'm wondering, in a perfect world where there is free speech uninhibited by government, do you believe that protests will lose their oomph?
Thank you. And so I return up here, lightning speech of 30 seconds each to answer question and also give your, if you want, final remarks. If you can all do that within that time frame. There was a specific question on Brazil, so I'll let you address that. Guilherme, start over there, and then we...
Okay. It's, the situation in Brazil is a curious one, but I think it's a serious problem that's happening all over the world. In Brazil, the population, the majority of the population is obviously against what's happening there. But there was, what I feel now, that's my main fear when it reaches the freedom of expression, is this cultural change that's going on all around the world. This fear of freedom of expression, out of fear of hate speech and fake news. And in Brazilian, just to understand that, most of the population is against the decisions of the Supreme Court. But the opinion makers, the traditional opinion makers, are more or less agreeing with them. So there is the question there. You mentioned how the population supports these decisions. They are not supporting, but there is this cultural change. Some people have fear of the Supreme Court, and some of them, those who could make a change, are in a certain sense supporting. But the thing is changing, shifting in the last months. I hope in 2 years we can have a different situation.
Thank you, Guilherme. Let's jump now over here to Rana.
I'm going to misuse the privilege of this mic today because I have something longer to say here, because we have been hearing my colleague from Hungary and from India. We're talking about George Soros, who has become a common enemy for both India and Viktor Orban and Modi, because every kind of criticism in the country about oligarchy is seen as a Soros-funded or CIA-funded. Poor George Soros, I have nothing for him, but I feel like he's been brought into this conversation out of nowhere to stifle free speech and voices, and they all operate from the same playbook. I do not see Modi and Viktor Orban or Netanyahu or Trump in isolation. I see them as a new a problem of the new world order, where they're trying to stifle free voices. There is a pushback, and the problem with dictators is that they do not see the rebellion that is brewing in their backyard. In India, Modi has used all central agencies and those institutions which were meant to protect democratic rights of the citizens of the country. They have become arms of the government. So when you have no criticism, when you have people, when people have been silenced into speaking, you do not know what's happening in people's minds, which is why Mr. Modi saw a reduced majority this time. So, and again, we don't have any platforms, but thanks to YouTubers, independent journalists in India are sticking their lives out there. I have a case of defamation against me for an article I wrote in 2009. Having said that, the last word that I'm going to say here is that many of us here sitting on this platform are popular voices. We are journalists who have traveled all the way from our respective countries to speak here about journalism under threat. So I must take this moment to acknowledge the more than 100 journalists killed in Gaza, in Palestine, who are not being celebrated, who should be spoken about, who are also doing the job of journalism, and they're not celebrated and unpopular. And they are being killed for bearing witness to what's happening in the world. So I had to put this in here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rana. Thanks for keeping up the fire from Masih Alinejad of being personally so engaged, and for your own investigative journalism. Sabo, over to you.
I'll try to be extremely quick. So I just met with 5 Republican senators in Budapest who came to meet with Viktor Orban. He refused to meet with them. They were like all moderates. John Cornyn from Texas was one of them. And yes, the MAGA right wing of the Republican Party, they are basically, they believe what Orban is trying to sell them, that Hungary is this anti-Muslim, pro-family, anti-woke country, but in reality, Hungary is basically a colony of Russia and China these days. So Orban's strategy is to use these, it is a smokescreen to disguise what he's doing, and unfortunately a lot of people on the MAGA wing of the Republican Party are not smart enough to see through this illusion. And just one thing that I wanted to mention, since Israel, Gaza, and everything came up. So when we did the Pegasus project investigation, what we saw is that basically Israel, and it's the Netanyahu government, it's not Israel, it's the Netanyahu government that used Pegasus as basically a diplomatic gift to Saudi Arabia, to the Emirates, to other Muslim countries, basically in order to gain diplomatic support. And when it comes to this whole issue in the Middle East, what I don't really see in these debates in the US is the complicity of Saudi Arabia, complicity of Egypt, complicity of other Muslim countries in this whole debate, because what I saw during this investigation is that basically the Netanyahu government is contributing to suppression in other Muslim countries in return for support for their policies in Palestine. I know that this is not black and white, and I know that confronting the truth is sometimes hard. But when it comes to geopolitics, the picture is always murky and blurry.
Thanks for giving us the truth of what you investigated. Jacob, you last, if you want to round this all up about the truth.
So if we already know the truth, we don't need free speech, right? Because free speech is necessary to approximate the truth. No one ever gets the last word, so I don't believe anyone should have the right to determine the truth. That's a core function of free speech. When it comes to apathy, this is actually my biggest fear in open democracies, is that there's no public pushback against these things. It's seen as sort of reasonable that maybe they went too far in this case, but there's no general sense that things are moving in the wrong direction. And so what I fear is that in 20 years, the environment is going to be very different. And I would say I'm actually surprised that Orban and others are not just doing what is being doing in France and Germany, sort of more aggressively arresting and prosecuting people under the pretext of saying, well, more than 1,000 people have been arrested for social media posts in Germany, so why don't we do the same? And that's obviously a distinct possibility. So without a culture of free speech, a robust culture of free speech where people speak out about it and do it on a principled basis, whether you're in favor or against Israeli policies, you stand up for free speech, and then you can take a separate position on the substantive issues. That's, I think, the way forward.
Thanks, Jacob. That brings our session to a close. I want you all to, yes, exactly, help me give a hand to these intrepid journalists.